This is the Boardhawk podcast. I'm Alan Gottlieb.
And I'm Alexis Minopel-Harrigan.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be back here with the Boardhawk podcast. And today it's just me as a host with a guest, former school board member Teresa Pena. And we are recording this podcast at a very interesting and strange moment. Or I would say we're living through extraordinary and probably unprecedented moments in the history of Denver public schools right now. It's Superintendent Alex Marrero, who has led the district for almost exactly 5 years now, clearly wants out. He's applied for at least 2, and I've heard maybe 3 other urban superintendencies. And one of those, Miami-Dade, he's still under consideration. Although a Miami Herald article came out yesterday that said that he does not meet one of the 3 key qualifications the board set for the candidates because he doesn't have any classroom teaching experience. So that doesn't mean he's necessarily been eliminated from consideration at all. Some board members in that story were saying we shouldn't throw people out based on that, but other board members said they should. So unclear what's going to happen there. But meanwhile, a letter that Marrero wrote to board president Xochitl Gaitan earlier this month came to light yesterday in a Chalkbeat story. The letter seems pretty clearly to me to be Marrero attempting to pave the way for getting out of his contract and receiving a full year's salary, which is $346,529, and various fringe benefits as he walks. The ostensible reason outlined in this letter is that members of the school board are violating the contractually agreed to dictates of policy governance, the framework under which the district operates. We'll get to that in a moment. But to me, this is a sleazy and underhanded move and certainly doesn't seem to take into consideration the best interests of Denver's children. Well, actually, then again, Marrero's departure might be in their best interest, so maybe in a strange way it does. We'll get to that as well in a moment. Alexis, as I said, is away today. I have a statement from her that I'll read in a couple of minutes. But meanwhile, I want to introduce Teresa. She first played a pivotal role in DPS as a child when she and her brother Craig were named as plaintiffs in the Keys case, which made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and brought busing for integration to DPS in the early 1970s. Pena later went on to serve 8 years on the Denver School Board, 2003 to 11, 4 of them as president. She was a member of the board that hired Michael Bennett as superintendent and was president when Bennett's successor, Tom Boasberg, was hired. She has remained an active advocate for Denver's children since leaving the board. I asked Teresa on because we go way back, and Teresa is a truth teller, and the present moment in DPS calls for that. So Teresa, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, always thrilled to talk with you, Ellen.
Thanks. Well, I want to go through some of this letter, that 4-page letter, not the whole thing that Alex Marrero wrote, but I know you've had a chance to at least glance at it and read the Chalkbeat story. And I just what are your top of the mind reactions to what's going on here?
Yeah, so the 2 things I was struck by is that he was critical about the board dysfunction. And I found that rather ironic because Alex, since the day he started, has contributed to the board dysfunction. And certainly the board is an elected group of 7 adults, and yet Alex has played one against the other. And, certainly the most recent thing that I found really distressing was when he went after John Youngquist and wanted a censure. I could not imagine any of the 3 superintendents I worked with ever going after a board member, an elected official, in that way. So I feel like it was very disingenuous to claim that the board dysfunction was part of his concern when he's contributed to that. And if you're being really honest, he lost 2 allies when Scott and Michelle were not reelected. And I think he is faced with a board who's holding him accountable in a way that he's never been held accountable. The other thing that was concerning to me was his threats around policy governance. And when I was part of the Latino Education Coalition, we were meeting with board members, and Milo Marcus and I had several meetings with Scott Balderman. And I shared with Scott that I felt the way he introduced policy governance a month before new board members were elected was wrong. I never believed that policy governance served the interest of the board. It served an intent for any superintendent to ice board members out. I didn't think there's lots of ways to do policy governance. The way that the one that was implemented, I felt really limited the authority and the work that the school board is really charged to do in the policies that have oversight over DPS. So I felt like Alex has used that policy governance as a club. He was really lucky in that Scott rushed that through. but it had never served the interest one of our children and two of our board members. So those two were the things that immediately struck me as really disingenuous on Alex's part. And I think to your point, I would argue that he has committed academic malpractice. So if I were on the board, I would be leading the charge to terminate him for cause because he's not met academic achievement goals. But certainly, I think to your point, he's looking for a way out. And so using that policy governance and what's written into his contract that really limit the authority of the board was very distressful to me.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. The way I've interpreted the way policy government governance is implemented in Denver is, there could be a continuum of how how it's implemented. On one side, you could have a benign government like Sweden or Denmark, and on the other hand side, you could have the Taliban, and this is like the Taliban version of policy governance.
Agreed. Yes. Yeah.
And it's absurd. And basically, just for listeners who may not be really well attuned to this, I don't want to get into the weeds, but policy governance basically, the way it's implemented here in Denver, it basically says the superintendent is completely and totally in charge of all operations of the district. And the board is basically relegated to creating a framework under which they can evaluate the superintendent for how well he performs, but that's all they do. And just to be fair, I feel like I understand the impetus behind this on some levels. There have been board members in recent years
Mhm.
who have been so intrusive and so meddling in the business of the district in a way that's inappropriate that you can understand why an administration might want to limit the ability of the board to do that. But this goes so far beyond that it's just crazy.
I want to address more things. So you just talked about kind of the evaluation in a different context. And that was another point that Alex made that he's
Mm.
had four evaluations. And again, I feel like with Alex, everything, it's a half truth. Yes, he's had four evaluations, but the last evaluation, again, as a superintendent, he has not followed the protocol of any of the superintendents I worked with, where it was really a 360 feedback. So
Right.
even though Alex was asking his principals to get 360 feedback from his teachers, Alex refused to do that, and it was just the board. And the board did a very isolated, not transparent evaluation. So using that, like, well, the board didn't do an evaluation and they should, but I've had four. Again, it's a half truth. It's always what Alex is up to. And his evaluations have not been transparent. And, the metrics that the board has given has been such a low bar that he would never pass in any other school district with the evaluation that they would hold a superintendent accountable for. So, and I guess the other thing I felt like, on my boards that I served on, there was some talk of getting an evaluation for the board or self evaluation. And I don't think that that's a bad idea. But as an elected official, you get an evaluation if you get reelected or not. So we saw that with Scott and Michelle not getting reelected. That's their ultimate evaluation. So my hope would be that this board would lead towards terminating him for cause, but we'll find out.
Yeah, well, I don't think he did himself any favors with this letter. I mean, a couple of responses to what you say, and then I want to get into the letter a little bit. One is that he talks about the board dysfunction, and this board is much less dysfunctional than the previous boards have been. The reason they are dysfunctional is because some new board members who didn't really know what was going on yet voted to make Sochi Gaitan the president of the board. She is so closely tied to Marrero and so
Mhm.
has his back that she has now alienated at least five of her colleagues pretty seriously. And one, Marlene De La Rosa, I think is trying to like bridge things and try and make peace. And it's not clear exactly where she stands, but the dysfunction is all on Sochi and her imperious way of serving as president and trying to limit what gets on the agenda. So it's not a dysfunctional board in that way. Another thing I just wanted to kind of add to that you said was you were talking about the attack on Youngquist and the censure of him by the previous board that was led by Marrero saying that John was a
Mhm.
racist, basically, and trying to undermine his job and take his job, which was kind of a paranoid rant as far as I was concerned. That is resurfaced in this letter because he basically says the board's attempt to hire their own legal counsel is suspicious because Aaron Thompson, who's the general counsel for the district and a black man, is one of the people who accused John of racial insensitivity, and basically John's now coming back around and trying to get back at Aaron by hiring a lawyer, a separate lawyer for the board, which is crazy talk. And if you know John at all this stuff is deeply unfair.
And Alan, the only thing I'd like to say about that is this is not the first time a board has wanted to hire their own lawyer. I was fortunate to work with two outstanding GCs
Mhm.
in DPS, but even the boards I served on, at different points, we wanted to hire our own legal counsel. And the superintendent never liked that idea. And I think as a board member, you want to be able to have objective, neutral feedback. So I don't know that that's necessarily a good idea or a bad idea, but this isn't the first board that has wanted to do that. And I would say, I mean, one of my criticisms about Alex is that he has a very mediocre to below average senior staff. I mean, probably some of the least performing people. And I would put Aaron into that category. These are people who do what Alex wants and are not independent, objective thinkers. So if I were on the board, I would probably also want independent legal counsel. It's not the first time that this has been raised. And to use that as, again, well, they're violating his contract, I find like, what are you hiding? If it be everything's great and everything's above board, why wouldn't you want somebody to come in and also say, yeah, everything's above board and we're doing everything right? So my guess is he's hiding something and he just doesn't want another lawyer to find out because Aaron and the other team are probably doing the cover ups for him.
It's kind of like having Donald Trump having his own personal lawyer serving as attorney general.
It's the same thing. You are absolutely right, Ellen. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to go through a little few pieces of the letter here, and,
Okay.
and let's just sort of comment on it. The first thing is he on the second page, he talks about a February 26th executive session during which this is directly from the letter, during which I was excluded despite explicit contractual language guaranteeing my participation in executive sessions, except when discussing my employment evaluation or compensation. That inclusion represented a direct violation of my employment agreement, and to date, I have not received a formal explanation regarding how it occurred, what governance analysis was conducted, or what corrective actions have been implemented to prevent a recurrence. One problem here, that executive session never happened. So Al, Alex Marrero found out that this was going to happen, and I don't have the backstory. I don't know why there was going to be an executive session that excluded him, but he raised an objection and they canceled it. So it never happened. So that's a little strange that he would be pointing this out.
Well, and Ellen, can I just point out? I mean, again, the disingenuousness of these allegations. This is the same guy after the deans were shot at East, went into executive session under his very average, mediocre general counsel, Aaron, and then they found out that it was a violation of executive session. So, this guy wants to play both sides. Like when it works for him, he works it. And when it doesn't work for him, he's a big crybaby. I mean, he has the thinnest skin of any superintendent that ever led DPS. And that's just another example. And to your point, it didn't happen. But like to claim that that was an issue when he actually went into executive session in violation of all the laws of this state, I find that like, again, this guy, you can't believe anything or it's a half truth.
Yeah. Okay. Next thing here that's really bizarre to me, and this gets at the heart of what's wrong here and why things need to get fixed. He brings up an April 15th board meeting during which the board voted to renew the contract or renew the status
Okay.
of the Luminary Learning Network. Alex Marrero worked very hard to try and get that stopped. He does not like innovation zones. They've killed all the other ones that existed, Beacon and the Northeast Denver Innovation Zone. And the Luminary Learning Network is the last one standing. In his arguments, both at a work session and then during this meeting, he basically said that it added to the segregation of the district because they were wanting to add a new school, Willow Elementary in Central Park, but which is a very integrated school. That was a very bogus pretext because in the actual motion to not allow Willow into the network, there was no mention of this segregation integration stuff. It was all based on academic performance or something else. So that was strange. But now in this letter, Alex Marrero basically says, and I'm going to read the exact language, but this is how I interpret it, that the board really had no right to even require a vote on this, that it should have been in his purview to make the determination, and that it was potentially a violation of policy governance even to vote on this, and it was bad. So I mean, here's the full paragraph that I'm talking about, and people can draw their own conclusions about whether I've interpreted it right. During the board's April 15th meeting, several questions arose regarding my recommendations and interpretation of board policy. These discussions reinforce an important governance question that remains unresolved. If a process, renewal of zones and addition of schools, if a process established by board policy is followed, is there an expectation that the superintendent must nevertheless bring forward a particular recommendation desired by individual board members? The answer to that question has significant implications not only for innovation applications, but for every area where the superintendent is expected to exercise professional judgment within the boundaries established by board policy. I mean, what's your take on that?
I think this is a great example of Alex's lack of political finesse because any of the three superintendents I worked with, for an important vote like that, which had a lot of community involvement and input, and there was a lot of conflict and tension around that, and you've identified some of them. Any superintendent I worked with would have worked individually with board members and known what the vote was going to be before he or she brought it to the board. And so the fact that Alex did not have those conversations with board members and know in advance that despite his recommendation to reject their application, he still brought it to the board and they rejected it. Now, this is the first time really that the board has rejected, I would say, a significant decision. And again, he took it hard, but I think it speaks to a lack of his political finesse that he didn't work with the board to either get them to yes and understand his rationale, and he took the risk and brought it to them knowing that he didn't have the votes. And if he didn't know, shame on him. And if he did, and now he's a crybaby about it, well, again, that's on him. So I just think it speaks to a lack of political savvy on his part. And I personally believe the board made the right decision. I think kids deserve good schools regardless of their ethnic background and regardless of their income. And Willow has certainly demonstrated a high performance.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. I want to read the paragraph also about, even though we already talked about this briefly, about the general counsel issue and whether they should have
Mhm, mhm,
their own lawyer,
mhm.
because I just think it's another holy shit in this letter. I'm also compelled to reiterate concerns regarding any efforts to create structures that function as a parallel legal advisory system separate from the district's general counsel. Given the substantiated findings involving Director Youngquist's conduct toward both General Counsel Aaron Thompson and me, any material changes to longstanding legal processes, legal reporting relationships, or governance support structures require heightened transparency and scrutiny. Such changes risk creating perceptions of retaliation, undermine established reporting structures, and further complicate governance responsibilities. Clearly another half truth here, because I don't think the board that the investigation, so-called investigation, substantiated, especially Alex Marrero's paranoid rantings about Youngquist being after his job, and didn't specifically, I don't think, address insensitivity toward Aaron Thompson, although that was one of the allegations that started the whole investigation.
Again, I'm going to say just the irony of Alex whining about the board wanting their own independent counsel. There are still several active lawsuits against the district that Alex is personally responsible for. You know, the termination of Kurt Dennis is one, the East Deans is another. There are several women that you and I both know and have worked very closely with, either in DPS or since they have left. That the allegations that he doesn't like to work with strong women, and when they stand up to him, he moves them on or out. I mean, it just feels the irony here that this particular allegation around lawyers when there's so many other active lawsuits against the district under his leadership. Again, if you have nothing to hide, why would you object to this? And my guess is he does have something to hide. And given his track record with these ongoing lawsuits, there's probably something that is not going to work in his favor. And that's why he's crying so hard about the board wanting to hire their own independent. And honestly, if you would hire highly qualified people, this wouldn't be an issue. The board would trust them.
There's also Brandon Pryor's lawsuit for being excluded from public
Right.
meetings,
Right.
and Kristen Fry's lawsuit because he was accused of assaulting somebody in the audience and then got lambasted by a bunch of board members and the superintendent publicly at a meeting for something that at least video evidence suggested she certainly didn't do the physical part. And he vigorously denies the racial slur part, and nobody seems to have heard that. So, and
6 to 8 active
it's
lawsuits. And I'm just
mhm,
trying to think, Ellen, during the time with Wartgo, Bennett, Boasberg, and then I was working for DPS under Susana, I can't remember any superintendent having this number of lawsuits filed against the school district. And I think it speaks to a lot of chaos that Ellen in charge of.
yeah. Here's where we get to what I think is really going on here is this paragraph that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to read some language, I think, from the contract so that we can discuss this. This is on the third of 4 pages. My contract expressly incorporates policy governance as the governing framework for the relationship between the board and superintendent. As such, adherence to governance process and board superintendent relationship policies is not merely aspirational, it is a contractual agreement. When those policies are repeatedly disregarded, circumvented, or selectively applied, the issue is no longer limited to governance practice. It becomes a matter of compliance with the terms under which I was hired and continue to serve. So the contract, I'm going to scroll down some notes I hear. The the contract reads that basically policy governance is what it governs the relationship between the superintendent and the board. Should the board, I'm reading directly from Alex Murrow's contract here. Should the board elect to materially alter the governance policy, such changes may be deemed by the superintendent a unilateral termination by the district as such term is defined in section 14B. The parties agree that a good faith discussion regarding a unilateral termination by the district under this section should take place prior to the superintendent exercising any rights under this section. Therefore, the superintendent will provide the board president, which is what this letter is, with a written notice of his concern that the board has materially altered its governing principles as described above 30 days prior to the superintendent terminating his employment with the district. Letter was written June 8th, so he can terminate his employment and claim all the money on July 8th. So keep your eyes open. During this 30-day period, the parties will enter into good faith discussions intended to resolve the parties' governance concerns. So, I mean, it couldn't be any clearer what's going on here when you read that, right?
Alex had a great lawyer, and the board had a terrible lawyer. That's what I take away from that contract, Alex. For
Well, I
Alex.
mean, why did the board let that contract go
Right.
through? So basically, if the board materially alters policy governments and Marrero, after the required notice and good faith discussion, chooses to treat that as unilateral termination, he's entitled to the same package as if they fired him without cause. That package is 12 months of his current salary, which is $346,529, compensation, which covers his supplemental retirement contributions and the benefits described there, cash payment for accrued unused vacation days, personal sick days, and sick leave, and 12 months of health insurance family coverage after separation. So that's what he will get if he, on his own, apparently under this contract, he can just say July 8th, you guys violated the contract. I tried to talk to you about it. You blew me off. I'm out of here. Give me my $346,000.
Well, you started this conversation, Alan, saying that there's a number of board members who are not satisfied with Alex's performance as a leader of this school district. And as a taxpayer, I would say it's worth that $500,000 to get rid of him and let him move on. I wouldn't necessarily wish his leadership on anybody else's children, but I care deeply, as you do, about Denver. On the other hand, I would say as a board member, it's a fiduciary responsibility and their board elected responsibility to hold this man accountable for the terms of that contract, of which I would hope that there's something in there about academic performance and leadership. And if we go through that, I would say he has failing grades, and then you term him for cause. So on the one hand, I feel like let's just get rid of this guy and help him to move on and eat that $500,000. And on the other hand, I think, no, he can't get away with this. He's been a bully for 5 years. And this is just one more example of him doing the right thing for Alex and like kind of a big finger to the kids of Denver.
Yeah, and circling back really quickly to the whole evaluation thing, the first evaluation that might actually have some real teeth and a board that's not super happy with him is due this fall. So maybe he's
Right.
trying to slip out the door before that happens,
Right.
because that'll hurt his chances to get another job.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
So here's where I think he might have miscalculated, and I'd love your take on this. One way or another, let's say the Miami job doesn't come through. If the Miami job comes through, good for him, bad for Miami, best wishes to one of the largest school districts in the country. But if it doesn't come through, it's an old maxim, and I think it's very true. It's really hard to find a job when you're unemployed.
Yes.
And so if Alex is out the door here, even if he thinks he made out like a king because he gets his full payout and everything, he's suddenly applying for jobs all over the place and he's unemployed. And none of this stuff that he's doing here is going to make him seem more employable to future prospective employers, right? Because he's creating a shitstorm.
Yes.
And he's just dead wrong on a lot of this stuff. So I think he's getting some really bad advice.
Well, Alex typically thinks he's the smartest person in the room, and so probably this was his play. I don't doubt that this is setting up this opportunity for him to leave, whether he gets a job or not. And certainly, LA Unified has opened up, and he's made no secret that this was just a launching pad to be in Denver to be able to move on to one of the big four school districts. And so now two of them are open. He lost out on Chicago, lost out on New York, so these are his last two chances. And if he doesn't get it, and if I were a board member, like I have gone through his record and I've seen what, he has done some things well. Under his leadership, there have been some good things in DPS. But if you really start going through the data, it's not that great from an equity perspective. Not if you look at gender, not if you look at ethnicity, and not if you look at income. But sure, we could celebrate the graduation rate. It's the highest it's ever been. What we don't talk about is remediation. What we don't talk about is the gap that still exists. Sure, great. DPS is now a green school. What we don't talk about is that still more than half of DPS children can't read and write and do math at grade level. So is that even a valid like thing to celebrate? And I think that the lack of honesty, it kind of goes back as we keep talking that Alex likes to tell the half truths. So we have gotten rid of all the data. Like when I was working in DPS, you could find data to the school level every year, and it told the good, bad, and everything in between. And Alex and his team have completely eliminated that. And so my question is, what are you hiding? If this is such a high performing, great school district under your leadership, show us the data. And he shows very selective data. So we talk about graduation rates, but it's being led by white students and non-FRL kids, which is great if you're a white kid with non-FRL. If you happen to be a Latino child on free and reduced lunch, this school district sucks. And I hold him accountable. He has 5 years. He can't keep pointing the finger back. I hold him accountable.
Yeah, those gaps haven't closed, and I mean the dishonesty in the way data is spun, including in his application, because I read it, the application, the Miami Herald published it, and all the applications. He basically spins the data in that application too, talking about great gains in NAEP scores and all of that stuff, which is the nation's report card, the national test that's given every couple of years. Denver looked better on the NAEP scores because affluent white kids do so well. But when you start pulling apart the data, the gaps between affluent white kids and low-income kids of color in Denver are wider than in many other urban districts.
The tragedy for that is Alex was a DEI hire. The board that hired him, like I was part of the Latino Education Coalition. We called every single board member and said, please wait, let's look at his record a little bit harder. And we pleaded with them to please not hire him. But every single one, they wanted a Latino, they wanted a bilingual person, they got him. And he has done more harm to children of color in his 5-year tenure. When you look at, I mean, again, I'm going to say there are some things he's done well. So the growth rates have increased for all students, but the equity gap between white students and children of color and FRL and non-FRL has grown under his leadership. And so, to celebrate these things without being honest about it, and especially for somebody who was hired because he was a bicultural person, I think he's done more harm than any of the last superintendents that I could think of in the last 30 years, especially for Latino and Black children and low-income children.
And yet it's spun that the previous regimes of Bennett and Boasberg and even Susanna were racist regimes that caused a lot of problems. And it's just, I wrote a piece recently about how this current administration seems to have a sort of pobrecito attitude toward low income kids of color. That, what do you, we can only do so much. Look at where they come from and look at the disadvantages they start with. And there's not, I mean, it's not that there isn't some truth to that. That schools can't solve all the societal problems that cause these inequities, but you
Yeah.
certainly shouldn't make them worse.
Yeah. Well, and two things I would say about that is that when I look at where DPS was pre-COVID and where we are today, we are one of the school districts who is just barely back to even. A school districts of like comparable demographics. So I've started looking at school districts that are kind of similar in demographics. And like Long Beach is the one that we always look to, for the last 25 years. It's been a very similar size and demographic one. They have closed the achievement gap more significantly than certainly, I mean, DPS isn't even close. They have stronger overall achievement, and they especially have more sustainable outcomes, especially on the literacy piece. In DPS, only 45% of our kids can read at grade level. And that to me is the biggest tragedy. So, this whole pobrecito mentality, I couldn't agree with you more because there are school districts like Long Beach, like Aldine, like Austin, who are doing better. And there are other school districts, including those three, that not only are they doing better than 2019, they are actually on a long-term trajectory to really improve overall academic achievement for all of their students. DPS isn't even close to that. And not only are we not close, we don't have a plan, Ellen. And that to me is like, what the hell is this school board doing? We've been talking like people that like the Denver plan, and that's fine, but at least it was a plan. At least you knew what the metrics were and what we were trying to accomplish. This guy, and originally he had like what, 100 different metrics that the board was evaluating him on, and then they narrowed that down. How about we just have three? How about we want the gap? We want reading to like be at 90%, and we want all kids on grade level at math. I mean, pick three easy ones. Not easy, because none of those are easy, but there are districts who are doing the work, Ellen, and Denver isn't and hasn't under his 5-year tenure.
Right. I think last thing, at least for me, a couple of things. One is this: if any of you out there listening, or all of you are as disturbed by this as the two of us obviously are, this is a moment when making your voices heard to your school board members is vitally important. Email them, flood their inboxes with "this should not stand. Do not let this guy slip out the door with all this money. Do not let this happen. Fight against what he's clearly trying to do." Let your board members know how you feel about what's going on right now. You can go on the DPS website and find their addresses. The general email address protocol is the board member's first name and underscore last name at dpsk12, all one word, .org. Or you can simply write board@dpsk12.org, and that goes to everybody. So please consider doing that. I also wanted to read the statement from Alexis because she couldn't be here and she felt really bad about that, but she's out of town on a work trip. So here's what she said. "I'm out of town on a work trip and sorry to miss today's recording. I had a chance to read Dr. Marrero's letter to the board, and while it raises important governance concerns, I'm disappointed that yet again, the conversation around Denver Public Schools seems centered on adult politics instead of students. Whether Dr. Marrero ultimately stays or accepts another opportunity, the real issue isn't one person's future, it's the instability that continues to distract from the work of educating kids. Leadership transitions happen, governance disagreements happen, but when they become the dominant story, students, families, and educators are the ones who pay the price. The board and superintendent both have a responsibility to rebuild trust, determine their respective roles under a newer board, and refocus on what matters most, improving outcomes for Denver students. That's the conversation our community deserves to be having." So I think that's a good way to put it. I feel like the disputes and the governance concerns all come from one side primarily here, but other than that, I agree with everything Alexis said.
Yeah. I want to share one thing because you have been on this journey with me with you for a long time. And in 2007, when we started the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post, and Bennett was our superintendent, and it wasn't a unanimous board. We had our disagreements. In April, the board wrote a letter, and we summarized an op-ed, and it established the need for change, embracing choice, fostering innovation. And then in February
I remember that.
2017, yeah, and so that was like a really powerful statement. We acknowledged that we had not met the promise, but like we can draw a line in the sand, like we are committed to this. In February of 2017, I wrote an op-ed and I got a little bit beaten up on about it. It was when it was, I think Amro was the board president and Barbara Bryan was the vice president, Boasberg was the superintendent. And I wrote an op-ed and it concluded that we had not met the challenges and that the promises that we made in 2007 were still unmet and that we failed. And I'm like, we failed, people. Like, we have to do better. Let's commit and do this again. And I feel like there was a statement in there and it said, we fundamentally need to transform a tired system that has not served our most vulnerable students. It's far easier to spin the statistics, justify the failures, and overhype the successes than it is to admit that as a school district and as a community, we continue to fail far too many of our children. And I would say that's Alex's biggest failure. And if he were to admit it and ask for the board to work with him, invite the community, invite the electeds to work with him, I think we'd have a very different school district today. But he's done none of that. And so still, you know, this generational neglect of our neediest students still exists. And it's what Alexis said, that it becomes adult issues and nothing in anything that Alex said addresses children. Nothing. And so, the tired trope of this is all about adult drama is still accurate. And our kids and our teachers continue to suffer that consequence. And that, to me, is the biggest tragedy, not just at DPS, but certainly here in Denver. It's very true under Alex's leadership.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is super important because it shows, I mean, we're really not like choosing sides, one side versus another. We're talking about something that's plagued this district throughout its history. And there have been moments when things have certainly started to show signs of significant improvement, but never good enough. And then there are moments of serious backsliding. And we've been in a serious backsliding moment, certainly since 2021, or, probably since COVID.
Right. At least since COVID, but Alex has perpetuated it. He has not improved it. And maybe that's where the board needs to have that conversation with him, hopefully this month before he does something on July 8th.
Right, right. Well, we now know the date when we actually look at the date of this letter and
Mhm.
and read that stuff from the contract. That's all I've got, Teresa. I think we've had a lot to say here, and it's been really enjoyable as always talking to you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, and we'll definitely have you on again because there's not going to be any shortage of stuff
Yes.
to talk about.
Well, we appreciate the work that you and Alexis continue to shine a light on with DPS. It needs to be elevated so people understand the impact. So thank you for your leadership, Alan.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We'll be back again soon with another episode of the Boardhawk Podcast. Bye, everybody.